Welcome to part 3 of the dictionary series. As you can see from today's slide, there are a lot of images that look disconnected and unrelated. But today I'm going to show how it is important to start reframing our conceptual framework of history. And that, I never like to begin a presentation with a lot of images on a slide, simply because the information should unfold in its sequential format. But today it's deliberate because my research demonstrates or documents how our conceptual framing is now moving towards a new reframing, so that these optics that you see today, they actually represent concurrent variables, or it's akin to having a bird's eye view of history. So, for example, if you look to the left, the 2,000-year-old stone face is from The Hague, Netherlands, or Nederlands. And I evidence the Vikings from the Scandinavian world. I talk a lot about them in issue 7 and their migratory patterns, material culture, and their sophisticated political and economic prowess, not widely discussed. So, for example, when I see a figure or an artifact from this time period that has this phenotype, I know what I am meant to be thinking about historically, not swayed by the dominant narrative of the bloodthirsty barbarian. So, for example, in issue 7 of the Viking world, incidentally, there's also a very good book called The Viking's Guide to Good Business, which is a 12th century text. But we find that the Vikings are being described as the Scandinavian world was a warring and intellectual class of black society, who also produced a complex political system based on maritime trade and commerce. Additionally, 3 Scandinavian kingdoms show a most wonderful collection of antiquities which stand unrivaled in Central and Northern Europe for their wealth of weapons and costly objects of gold and silver, which show the skill of the people working in iron, ripuus, work of gold and silver, bronze, and wood covered with the thinnest sheets of gold. Now, let's just keep the riches of gold and silver and those precious metals in mind as we move to the central image of King Athelred. Now, what we know about those foundational rulers of Britain, such as King Athelred, who is fleeing from the Danes in 1013. Now, Athelred is Edward the Confessor's father, and remember, Edward the Confessor built Westminster Abbey. You see, this is what onomastics and deep research allows you to do. Every time you mention a name, you're able to put the optics in your head through the reframing process, and then you can support that with the scholarly work and the primary source evidence. Now, back to the riches. If I go to page 36 in the dictionary, part 2, the new book, I find something very interesting. That I'm now looking at an image, a magnificent image of King William Rufus, who would is the son of William Conqueror. Now, when his father dies, William, the Normans were to be engaged to him chiefly by money, and therefore to gain them he went presently after the coronation to Winchester, where his father's treasure lay, and emptied it out all to them. So his court is full of Normans. 'Tis said the treasure consisted of £60,000 in money, a tremendous amount in those days, besides jewels, gold, plate, and thousands of pounds. The sum of £60,000 in the 12th century would be the monetary equivalence in 2017 of £43 million. Now, according to Sawyer, this is important, he reminds the reader that England was a rich country in the 11th century. It was the wealth of England, not the inadequacy of the English defences, that tempted so many continental adventurers to come here in search of loot and tribute. Now, let's just keep in mind what's happening in the Scandinavian world, what is happening in King Athelred's time span and the chronology, because if we move to page 40, the Viking raiders extorted very large sums from the English in the reign of Athelred, sometimes spelt with an E in the centre. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in 991 they were paid £10,000, in 994 £16,000, and in 1002 £24,000. 5 years later, the Vikings took 36,000, and 5 years after that, 48,000. When Canute had finally conquered the country, he imposed the most massive tribute of all, £72,000, and a further 10,500 was paid by the citizens of London. The wealth that interested the warriors of the 11th century was not a wealth of pots and pans, nor cloth or corn, but wealth of precious metal, gold and silver. It was in gold and silver that the Vikings were bought off and paid. The numismatic evidence that 11th century England had a substantial silver currency is also confirmed by Domesday Book. This is the work of Sawyer. In today's monetary equivalents, the 11th century tributes or blackmail figures would equal to millions upon millions of pounds today. And so the wealth of England during this very early part in history is quite staggering. And the gold and silver is not widely spoken about or understood in terms of the accruement of wealth, you see. And this is so very important as we begin to understand those three figures on this page. This bird's eye view that is now being created in our minds to cement our conceptual reframing is brought about by the dictionary series, but the other pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, which are part of MFIT's research, issues 1 to 18, although I'm kind of under pressure to get part 2 done, but that's going to be probably sometime next year. But the wealth of England is simply staggering. It's coming up from France, it's also going to come up from Germany, and all of those wars and conflicts, we need to understand them as we ground them in history. This is what the dictionary series part 2 is becoming. It's a powerful vehicle for the documentation of true history, but it also reinforces how foundational truth will keep operating. It just keeps unfolding. And for those individuals who are sat there frothing at the mouth and steam coming out of their ears saying the Vikings weren't black, do please read this issue of the Vikings, which is issue 7. It has primary evidence and scholarly articles that support my position today. Now, you will also be aware of, because there's just so much information to impart, I have to be very careful that I don't start going off into all different directions. But the image that you saw on the other slide, the opening slide, with the yellow background, has Arturo Schomburg. Now, a lot of people know who he is. He's a very famous historian, curator. And he is documented in part 2, in which I evidence a connection with the foundational black surname Cosway and Schomburg. And you will see how they are related onomastically. And this is what we need to start doing. We need to clear the decks and start to reframe our minds as we understand who and what was happening during those different periods in England and how England became so wealthy. And so, as we draw to a close, I hope that you are inspired to dig deeper and find out more about FB history. Until next time, Ku Amsha, to awaken.